Some places are famous for what we know about them. This one is famous for what we don't. You have seen it 1,000 times. A row of giant stone faces on a green hill, staring inland, backs turned to the sea. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, the most remote inhabited place on Earth, a speck of volcanic rock in the South Pacific, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. And on that speck, a people carved nearly 1,000 giants out of the mountain and stood them up. We call the statues the moai. Most people think they are just heads. They are not. The famous heads of Easter Island have bodies. Dig down, and almost every one of them has a torso buried under centuries of soil, long fingers carved across the belly, a spine, ribs, ears, waiting in the dark. The photographs only ever show us the part that stuck out of the ground. But the real mystery of Easter Island was never how they were carved. It was what happened after. Because the same island that raised these giants was later found nearly empty, its forests gone, its statues toppled face down in the dirt. For 200 years, we told ourselves one story about that, a story about a people who destroyed their own world. And in the last 20 years, science has started to take that story apart. So sit with 3 questions. How did a Stone Age people move 90-ton statues across an entire island with no wheel, no metal, and no animals to pull them? Why would they suddenly stop, leaving hundreds of moai unfinished in the rock? And what really happened here if the story we all learned turns out to be wrong? This is the story of the statues that outlived the world that made them. Chapter 1. The statues that shouldn't stand. Start where the moai were born, a single volcanic crater on the eastern end of the island called Rongorongo. Walk up to it today and the ground itself looks alive. Faces push out of the hillside at every angle. Some stand upright to the shoulders, sunk in the earth. Some lie on their backs, half cut from the bedrock, still attached to the mountain by a spine of stone. This was the factory. Almost every moai on Rapa Nui was carved here, from the same soft volcanic rock, and then somehow taken away. Look at the scale, and it stops making sense. The finished statues average around 13 feet tall and weigh about 14 tons. But the quarry holds monsters. One unfinished giant, still lying in the rock, would have stood nearly 70 feet tall and weighed over 200 tons if they had ever raised it. That is heavier than a blue whale, carved by hand with tools of stone. And that is the first impossible thing. The people who made the moai had no iron and no bronze. They shaped these giants using hand picks made of harder volcanic stone, called toki, striking the rock again and again, thousands of blows, sharpening the tool as it wore down and going back to work. You can still see the picks lying where they were dropped, scattered across the quarry like the workers just walked away. Run your hand along an unfinished moai, and you can still feel the tool marks, thousands of tiny bites in the stone, each one a single swing of a human arm. A large statue could take a team the better part of a year, striking the rock from dawn to dusk, turning a mountainside into a face. Now comes the harder question. The statues were carved here, but they stand there, on stone platforms all around the coast, some of them 11 miles away. Each one weighs as much as a truck. So how do you move a 14-ton stone giant across a rocky island when the wheel has not reached you, and there is not a single horse or ox on the entire island to pull a load? For a long time, the leading answer was simple. They dragged them. Teams of people lay the moai flat on a wooden sledge and hauled it over log rollers. hundreds of hands on plant fiber rope, inch by inch across the island. It works on paper. It also would have swallowed enormous amounts of timber and rope and food. But the people of Rapa Nui had a different explanation, and for years nobody took it seriously. Their oral tradition says the moai were not dragged at all. It says the statues walked. Here is the strange part. In 2012, a team of researchers tested it. They built an exact replica of a real moai, wrapped ropes around its head and sides, and had 3 small teams pull in rhythm: left, right, left, right. And the statue rocked. It leaned, swung one edge forward, then the other, and began to move upright, waddling down the road under its own shifting weight. A 5-ton copy walked hundreds of feet in a matter of minutes with fewer than 20 people. The roads support it too. The ancient moai roads are slightly concave, curved like a shallow channel to hold a rocking statue upright. And the moai that were abandoned along those roads tell a story. The ones lying on the way up from the quarry tend to lie on their backs. The ones lying on the way down lie on their faces, exactly the way a walking statue would fall depending on the slope. The islanders were not telling a fairy tale. They may have been telling us in plain words that the giants walked, and we simply were not listening. And raising them was only the beginning. On top of many moai, they set a second stone, a massive cylinder of red rock called a pukao, a kind of topknot or crown carved in a completely different quarry on the other side of the island and hauled to the coast on its own. Some of these red crowns weigh more than 10 tons. They lifted them onto the heads of statues already standing 20 feet in the air. Then came the final act. The islanders carved eyes. Working the white of coral and the dark of volcanic glass, they set gleaming eyes into the finished faces on the platforms. In their belief, this is the moment the statue woke. The eyes gave the moai its mana, its spiritual power, and turned a block of stone into a living guardian, watching over the people below. When you look at a bare moai today, you are looking at a statue with its eyes closed. Almost all of those coral eyes are gone now, and that absence is its own quiet clue to what came later. So they carved them, and they crowned them, and they walked them home, and they woke them on the coast, hundreds of them, facing inland to watch over the living. And then, at the height of it all, the carving stopped. In the quarry, tools lie mid-strike. Statues sit half-finished in the rock, forever. Something happened, and to understand it, we have to leave the mountain and look at the whole island. Chapter 2. The Island That Ran Out of World. Picture Rapa Nui when the first people arrived, most likely from Polynesia, sometime around 800 years ago. It was not the bare grassland you see in photos today. Pollen trapped in the island's lake beds tells us it was covered in forest. Millions of giant palm trees, some of the largest palms that ever lived, along with other trees and seabird colonies thick across the land. The settlers found a green world. They built a society on it, one organized enough to feed carving teams, move giants, and compete, clan against clan, to raise the tallest and grandest moai on the coast. For centuries it worked. Then the trees began to disappear. This is the story most of us grew up with, and for a while the evidence looked brutal and clear. The pollen record shows the forest thinning and then vanishing. By the time Europeans arrived, there was not a single tall tree left on the island. The palms were simply gone. The popular explanation became one of the most famous cautionary tales in modern history. It goes like this. The islanders, obsessed with building ever bigger statues, cut down their forest to move them. Log rollers, sledges, ropes, all made of wood. They cleared the land for farming and burned it for fuel. And as the last trees fell, everything unraveled. No wood meant no canoes, so no deep-sea fishing. No forest meant soil washing into the sea. Food collapsed, and a starving, desperate people turned on each other and on their gods, pulling down the very statues they had once worshipped. In this telling, Easter Island becomes a warning written in stone. A closed world, a people who used up everything they had, and a civilization that ate itself alive. A tiny model of our own planet. It is a powerful story. It has been in textbooks, documentaries, and famous books for decades. There is just one problem. When scientists went back to the island in the last 20 years and actually dug, the evidence started to disagree. Chapter 3. The Lie We Were Told. Start with the trees, because the trees are real. The forest did vanish, but the reason may not be the one we were sold. When those first settlers landed, they did not arrive alone. Their canoes carried the Polynesian rat, whether as a stowaway or as food. On an island with no predators and endless palm seeds, rats breed at a staggering rate. A single pair can multiply into millions in a few years. And when researchers examined the ancient palm nuts preserved in the ground, they found them covered in the gnaw marks of rats, the seeds eaten out before they could ever sprout. The people cleared trees, yes, but they may have been fighting a losing battle against millions of rodents eating the forest's future one seed at a time. The palms fell and never grew back, not simply because of greed, but because the next generation of trees was being devoured underground. Now the bigger claim, the idea that the islanders starved and crashed into war and cannibalism, that they collapsed before outsiders ever arrived. This is the heart of the old story, and it is exactly the part that is falling apart. Look at how they farmed. Rapa Nui is windy, dry, and thin-soiled. So the islanders did something ingenious. They covered their gardens in broken volcanic rock, a technique called lithic-mulching. The stones shelter young plants from the wind, trap moisture, and slowly release minerals into the soil. Far from helpless, these were expert farmers who engineered their land to survive. Recent studies of these rock gardens suggest the island could feed only a few thousand people, which means it may never have held the huge, overshot population the collapse story needs. There was no crash from a peak, because the peak may never have been that high. And the statues. The story says a starving people angrily toppled their own moai. But archaeology shows the moai were still being built, moved, and cared for late into the island's history. Many were not smashed in some ancient frenzy at all. Some fell over time. Others appear to have been laid down deliberately, perhaps as beliefs changed. The picture is not a society destroying its gods in a panic. It is a society still functioning, still working the stone. So what actually happened to the people of Rapa Nui? The most brutal answer is also the most documented, and it did not come from inside the island. It came by sea. The first European ship reached the island on Easter Sunday, 1722, which is how it got the name Easter Island. The people who met those first sailors were healthy and numerous. What followed over the next century and a half was catastrophe, and none of it was carved into stone by the islanders. European contact brought new diseases the islanders had no defense against, and in the 1860s, slave raiders arrived and shipped away a huge share of the population, including much of the ruling and priestly class, the very people who carried the island's knowledge. Within a few years, through slavery and disease, the population of Rapa Nui crashed to just over 100 souls, and the loss went deeper than numbers. Rapa Nui had something almost no other Pacific culture ever developed, a written script of its own, carved into wooden tablets, a system of symbols we now call rongorongo. It may have held their histories, their genealogies, their prayers. But the slave raids of the 1860s carried off the chiefs and the priests, the only people who could still read it. When they were gone, the knowledge went with them. To this day, no one on earth can fully translate rongorongo. An entire written language went dark in a single generation, not because a people forgot it, but because the people who carried it were stolen. That is the real collapse. Not a Stone Age society eating itself in blind greed, but a living culture gutted from the outside, its memory and its people carried off in chains. The forest loss was real, and the islanders lived through it and adapted, for centuries, on the loneliest scrap of land on Earth. The story that they simply destroyed themselves quietly erases what was actually done to them. Which forces one uncomfortable question. Why did we believe the other version for so long? Chapter 4. The Question in the Stone. There's something a little too convenient about the old story of Easter Island. A people so foolish they cut down their last tree. A civilization that committed suicide by stupidity. It lets everyone else off the hook. It turns a human tragedy into a morality tale about someone else's failure. The stones tell a different story, if you let them. They tell you that a few thousand people, on a dot of rock 1,000 miles from anywhere, with no metal, no wheel, and no draft animals, carved giants heavier than airplanes and walked them across the horizon. They tell you those people were not primitive. They were engineers, farmers, astronomers, and artists, solving problems on a scale that still makes modern experts argue about how it was even possible. And the moai themselves, we now think, were never just monuments to dead chiefs. Many stand on platforms that hold the bones of ancestors. They face inland, toward the villages, toward the living. They were guardians. A way of keeping the dead present, watching, protecting, generation after generation. The giants were not a symptom of a society going mad. They were the opposite. They were an act of memory, of belonging, of a people saying, "We were here, and we will not be forgotten." And in the strangest way, it worked. The world that raised them is gone. The forest is gone. The old kings and priests were carried off in chains. But the moai are still standing, re-raised on their platforms, still facing the island, still watched by millions of people who come to the ends of the earth just to stand in their shadow. So here is the question the stones leave you with. We remember Easter Island as a warning, a story of a people who destroyed themselves. But what if the truth is almost the reverse? What if they were far cleverer and far more resilient than the story ever allowed, and the real damage came from the world that found them? How many other lost civilizations have we written off as foolish, simply because it was easier than admitting what was really done to them? The people of Rapa Nui carved their answer into the side of a mountain and stood it up to face the horizon. After everything, the statues are still there, still staring inland, still asking us to look closer. We are the ones who keep looking away.